What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Surf and Sales podcast. This is season 2, episode almost 30, 28, 29, something like that. Richard's giving me hand signs over here. I can't tell exactly what he's doing. We are brought to you by our good friends at Salesforce Revenue Cloud, Gong.io, and Lead411.com. And I'm here with my good friend, Richard Harris. And we are joined by a good friend from West Virginia who's been giving me all sorts of grief about my snowpocalypse situation here in Austin over the last couple of weeks. He's a field reimbursement manager at Exenda. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I can't wait to hear what field reimbursement manager means these days. But most people probably know him as the host of the Intentional Encourager podcast. And we are here with Brian Sexton. How's it going, Brian?
Scott, Richard, man, this is going to be a blast. I appreciate you guys having me on. And I'll explain to you, Scott, what a field reimbursement manager is. It's a fancy title for doing a little bit of work. So, but man, what an opportunity to be on with you guys. I appreciate it. And Scott, by the way, you've been on the Intentional Encourager podcast, and I just recorded an episode with Richard. It's coming out in a couple of weeks. So, great. I appreciate you guys giving us the opportunity to mash up the two podcasts, man. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the podcast. Tell us about the idea for the Intentional Encourager, and what the show's all about.
Yeah,
and what you're all about. It's really what you're all about.
Well, Scott, I'll tell you this, man. I have always believed in encouraging. Always believed in connecting. And so I would do that when I was in sales with my customers. I would be a shoulder to cry on, an advisor. And those are ways to encourage. And so people had been telling me for a good while, you got to do a podcast. And I'm a sports guy. And I thought, well, I can do a sports podcast, and I have a heavy background in sales. I thought I could do that. But man, what you and Richard are doing is so good. And other friends of ours in the sales world, I thought, man, let's let those guys do their thing. And I'll focus on a niche that I felt like wasn't being filled, and that was intentional encouragement. And so my goal with the podcast, Scott, is to be the place on LinkedIn that if you're an influencer or you've got a rock star story to tell, like you told your story and Richard told his, that I want to be the podcast to do it. And we have had some unbelievable guests, and it's been great. We're about to release our 100th episode, and that's mind-boggling to me that we're about to push 100 episodes. But the podcast really is about, in 3 parts, it's telling your current story, talking about things that you've done around different things. And then when we finish the last 15 minutes or so, it's about your life story, the obstacles that you've overcome, and the biggest lesson you learned from it, and your biggest piece of intentional encouragement. So, man, it's been a blast to do. And every episode, there is some kind of surprise in there that just kind of that just blows me away that people are willing to share that part of their story.
What have been the commonalities in the best stories of these 100 episodes and stories that you've captured? What's some of the things that people do best as the way they tell their story?
Man, I'll go back, Scott. I'll go back to our conversation, which is episode 25. And I love the fact that you and I were just having a raw, real conversation, like we were sitting across the table from each other. And that's the goal every time, is to replicate that to where the audience, when they plug their headphones in or however they consume the podcast, they're feeling like they're sitting in the room with us, listening to the two of us talk. And so what I loved about your episode, man, was you weren't afraid to just tell me what was going on in that time in your life where you were dealing with some unbelievable struggles physically. And Richard's episode, I'll tease it a little bit. Richard and I went deep on some things that he overcame. But the constant story is, I overcame, and here's how I did it. And here's my biggest piece of intentional encouragement to help somebody else that's walking down that road.
Now, what I love about this is, I think it's the distinction is obvious for people who can recognize and identify things that they've gone through or are going through that are really difficult. And I think that it's direct access to, you know, powerful stories of, you know, people getting knocked back and picking themselves back up and pushing on.
Yeah.
What I worry about, and I'm curious your take here, and I've got this feedback before. What I worry about is, what about the people who haven't gone through something that they would deem to be, you know, devastating or life-threatening or something like that? You know what I mean? I hear people sometimes, and they're like, well, fuck, Scott, do I need to like almost die in order to figure this shit out? I'm like, I hope not, right? Don't go that route. What do we do for those people who might feel like they haven't gone through anything, you know, that extreme?
Well, two things I'll say to that, Scott, is number one, if you haven't gone through anything like that, don't worry, your time's coming, because life has a way of bringing it to you. And, you know, because I was 40 years old the first time that I had a real life event that rocked me to my core, and that was when my dad passed away. And so, you know, I'd gone through stuff. I'd lost the best man in my wedding. I'd lost my father-in-law. Those didn't shake me like losing my dad did. So I would say to those people, just hold on. Your time's coming, because life is going to kick you where it hurts. And you're going to have to go face to face with understanding some of the commonalities we talk about on the podcast. But the second thing I would say is life experience is commonality. And I would say this, whether you've not gone through a divorce or a health struggle or, you know, almost losing your life, you probably have gone through something personally, especially in sales. You're going to go through those things that are going to test your resolve. And I think what we do on the Intentional Encourager podcast is we say, listen to this. Even if you're not going through something at the moment, it will inspire you to say, hey, my good days are coming. If I'm walking through a valley a little bit, you know, professionally or whatever, it's an inspiring story, man. I don't know who can't get behind a good, uplifting, inspiring story, because it encourages you. And it with all the crap going on in the news right now, man, we need some good inspirational stuff of people actually overcoming and doing really good, positive things out there in the world.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really important. And I wonder if, you know, are there people who've never gone through something? Like, I don't know, you know, now, is it going to be like what I've been through or what Scott? Maybe not to that external degree, but internally and emotionally, you know, did they break up with a girlfriend? Did the girlfriend or boyfriend break up with them? Did you know, they almost lost their job? Somewhere, nobody is stress free, right? Like, I just can't believe that. So the question then is, how do people respond to that stress? But I don't know, Scott, do you really know, Scott? Do you know people who don't have some level of stress?
No.
Or are you talking about like at our level?
They don't mean it like that. The people that I hear from, it's not that they don't have stress, but they're like, listen, you know, I grew up in an affluent neighborhood. My parents are still together. I've never broken a bone. You know, I never lost anything devastating, right? Like, how do I tap into that grit or that resolve if I haven't gone through anything like that? And so I think there are people like that. I hear from them. If I sat down with them and got to know them long enough, I could dig in and find something that was painful, or something that they've gone through that would have been really hard for me, that I could say to them, I don't know how you got through that. I might not have been able to get through that. You look at me and think you couldn't get through what I got through. I have the same vibe with you. But people really do. I get asked that question a lot, Richard.
Interesting. I find that interesting. Brian, do you know people
Richard,
like this? Like,
well, Scott, I was just going to say, you know, living in West Virginia and Southeast Ohio most of my life, when you were talking about affluent neighborhoods, are you talking about the people that had double wide trailers or single wide trailers? Because affluent in our region would be the double wide trailer.
Yeah,
different. When you move up to the double wide, then you've made it.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I'm like, there's something I could say, but I can't because it would be ridiculously inappropriate. So Brian, do you know people like this? Like, how do you?
Yeah.
What do you find if you know? Are you able to have those conversations with people to kind of make them go, oh, wait a minute, I have had a struggle?
Yeah. Well, Richard, I've said this before a bunch of times, and I'll say it here again. The greatest relationships are always cultivated in common ground. And so you just find an opportunity to connect with that person and say, you may not have gone through this, but let's talk about something that affected you. And it may have been low self-esteem. They may have grown up in an affluent neighborhood, and they may have grown up with a lot of advantages, but maybe they were picked on. Maybe they were bullied when they were a kid, and it's kind of hung with them, and they've overcompensated to kind of, to make up for that. And so I think you can always find a place of common ground. But man, encouragement is universal. I mean, even just telling somebody, hey, look, man, things are going to get better, because I don't know who hasn't been impacted by the pandemic that we've gone through. I mean, we all know somebody or several somebodies that have had COVID-19. And again, you could start there and say, hey, man, just thank God we're all healthy and well and safe, and we're able to breathe air for another day. Because, man, if I know this, man, and Scott, this, and Richard, this as well too. Life is fragile, man. I mean, I talked to my dad at 4:00 the day before he died, and that was the last conversation I ever had with him. And so I know in an instant, man, life is fragile. And so if you can't encourage somebody with a good word or just something positive, then I'm kind of wondering if that person just have kind of insulated themselves from anything good being spoken into their lives.
Is that person just a narcissist, right? Like, is that the
Could be,
ultimate
yeah.
definition of a narcissist, right?
Yeah,
So
could be.
talk about your upbringing and sort of how you got into sales, and I know you said you're a sports guy. Did you play a lot of
Yeah.
competitive sports? Were you the kid who had a lemonade stand? Like, where did you connect all these dots into revenue?
Played baseball growing up. I was a pitcher and outfielder. I played all the way through high school. I was undefeated my senior year in high school. I was 2-0. And I'll tell you a quick story. We were playing a team one night, and I was the starting pitcher. And this little 4'2" second baseman comes up. I throw my best fastball. We're playing at home. I throw my best fastball, but it was right down the middle. And this kid absolutely crushed it. Like I had underhanded it to the plate, and he just rocked it, hit it to left center field. We had an ethanol plant across the street from our high school field. That thing on the fly goes into the ethanol plant. And so I'm like, man, I just got taken deep here. This is not good. But I finished the game. We won, got the win. I think I went 6 or 7. I may have thrown a complete game, but other than that kid, and they're like, man, that kid's never hit a ball that far in his life. Well, my dad and I are pulling out, and we see the ball sitting across the inside the fence. And Dad goes, you want to go get the ball? I'm like, why do I want that ball, man? That kid hit that ball about 500 feet off me. Why do I want the freaking baseball? My dad was like, nah, let's go get it. I'm like, all right, let's go get it. So he pulls up, makes me get out and go ask the security guard. It's like, can I have that ball? And the guy's like, I don't care. Go get the ball. So I still have the ball that kid hit about 480 feet off me in high school. But yeah, I still have it. But growing up, I went to Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. Yeah.
So what does that ball mean to you now? What is that? How does that, in terms of being intentional and inspirational?
It reminds me of the time that little 4'2" kid took me about 500 feet, man. I still have flashbacks of a crick neck looking up and seeing that ball just descend.
Did that encourage you to focus harder? Did that encourage you to, again, sometimes we have reminders of bad things to help us, do better, right? Like, you don't need to keep that baseball. You're a grown man at this point, right? Like,
well, Richard, what it
just a child in a grown man's body, depending on.
Yeah, well, yeah, there you go. Well, what it reminds me of is anytime we can get taken deep. I mean, in sales, you're going to get taken deep. In life, you're going to get taken deep. You can throw your best fastball out there to the world, and it gets rocked. I mean, the greatest pit. Clayton Kershaw. I think Kershaw still make either him or Trevor Bauer, either one. I think the Dodgers have like 4 of the highest paid guys in baseball right now. I don't care who you are, the greatest pitchers of all time, you're going to get taken deep. You can be the very best in the world, and somebody is going to time you up just right and take you deep. So that's what that reminds me of is that I've got to continue just to throw my best fastball. If it gets taken deep, it gets taken deep. It's going to happen. And so, but yeah, to continue that point, I didn't play baseball past high school. It reminds me of it encourages me of better days, reminds me of times with my dad out in the yard playing catch. But I didn't set out to go into sales, Richard, to answer your initial question. I started out to be a broadcast journalism major. I wanted to be the voice of the Cincinnati Reds. That was my dream.
Listen to him talk, Richard. You guys made for radio with this voice.
That was my dream, man. I wanted to be the voice of the Cincinnati Reds, but I was working at a grocery store, and there was a guy who was a local sports talk host that would come into my grocery store, and I connected with him and talked with him, and he gave me a piece of advice. He said, Brian, go into print journalism. They make more money. And so August 13th, 1990, man, my 18th birthday, went to Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati, and the Reds and the San Francisco Giants were playing that game. And the 1990 team is my favorite team of all time. That was the Reds team that went wire to wire. They led the first day of the season all the way through to the World Series. And we saw the assistant sports editor of the newspaper. He was 2 years behind my dad in high school, and I ended up getting a part-time job at the local newspaper in the sports department. So I was going to college, working at a grocery store part-time, and then from August to March, I was working in the sports department of our local paper 2 nights a week and dating a girl at the time. So I had a lot of balls in the air, but what got me to sales was I had to work for the school newspaper. It was a requirement to work for the school newspaper. And I was like, well, why do I want to give up 2 jobs that are paying me money for one that doesn't? And I was like, screw that. I'm just going to go into marketing. So my dad was a salesman. My uncles were salesmen. Just a natural fit to transition into sales.
Now, talk about this field reimbursement manager role.
Yep.
I want to start here, and I want to take it to this other place, because you're not in software sales. You're not in tech, and I don't think it gets as much hype. I don't know the right word. It's not talked about as much, at least in my world. As tech sales. So what is this role? What do you do day to day?
In a nutshell, I help. So I'm in the pharmaceutical industry. So what a field reimbursement manager is we provide education around patient access. So in other words, if you're trying to get on a therapy for a particular disease state and your doctor's office is doing prior auths and things like that, I'm the guy that they call for help on that. That is the short, quick, down and dirty answer. If you need help with copays, that's me. If you need help with, if you get denied for something, and in knowing your background a little bit too, it's an important role, because there are a lot of patients out there that are struggling because their insurance companies are putting barriers in place to try to keep them from the therapies that are going to help them live better lives. And so my job is to help those offices clear those barriers.
So I pay somebody like you to deal with all this stuff that drives me nuts.
Well, the pharmaceutical companies actually, we have pharmaceutical clients that work with companies like mine. So they hire us to be their field access their field access people to help their offices understand the access barriers to these different medications. Yeah.
Now, what does the non-tech sales world need to learn from the tech sales world?
Man, I was to quote Chevy Chase from the old Saturday Night Live show, I was told there would be no mascot, Lease. Well, here's what I would say. I would say this. It is that I've been intentional not only about encouragement, but connection. And I don't care what you're selling. I think we need to do a better job of understanding what connection really is. So let me answer your question this way, Scott, and take it after I say it, take it in the direction you want to go and push back a little bit. But we've got a misconception of what connection is, because we go to LinkedIn or we go to Twitter or we go to Facebook and we hit a little button that says connect or follow or add friend. And a lot of people are just doing that for what they can get from it. And that's not connection. Connection is giving first. Why do I want to connect with this person? Why do I want to be a part of their world? and to me, connection is about relationship building. So to kind of answer your question, and again, push back if you want to. I believe that anybody in sales needs to understand the real value and power of connection.
And then the inverse of my question: what do people in the tech sales world need to learn from people in the non-tech sales world?
Well, I think people in the non-tech sales world have figured out that connection is important.
So the
And I think,
non-tech sales world is better at connection, you think?
again, that's where I've spent the part of my career is in the non-tech sales world. So I would say
you might be right. I just find it a little bit ironic that technology, which has been built so much to connect us and bring us together, people in the non-tech sales world are potentially better at connection than in the tech sales world.
Well,
how do you help someone become better at this connection? Right? Like
well,
what are 3 things you say, hey, do this to try and drive better connections?
Well, the first thing is you have to understand that people buy connection before they ever make a transaction. So understanding how those customers that you're trying to connect with like to connect. And Scott, you've done a lot of good work. My hat's off to you. You're intentional about putting it out there when people come and try to connect with you in ways that are not cool. And I'm 100% on board with you. I think a lot of people are trying to just fill their pipelines and build their funnels without really understanding what it takes to do that. So, Richard, I would say this: people buy connection before they ever make a transaction. The second thing I would say is that you have to understand that consistency is key. I had to learn this the hard way in sales. When I got consistent in my method and my process and how I connected with customers, I got really good at sales. So you have to understand that consistency is also important as well too.
So how do you? But I want to go deeper, right? Like I love the buzzword. Like I love the idea of people buy a connection before a transaction. But how do you teach that, right? You've got somebody who's new into sales, and I don't care if it's tech or not. I agree with you 100%. How do you teach somebody that? How do you teach them that in a way that makes it so they can sound authentic and be authentic and not sound fake? We actually just had a conversation about fake empathy like 10 minutes ago. So how do you, what advice do you give to those people to teach them how to connect?
Richard, I love this. It's what I did with my 20-year-old son. And we were the first time it kind of came to light, and it was that moment where I could go deeper with him. My son, about 6 years ago, went to a basketball camp at Duke University, and Coach K, the legendary coach at Duke, was talking to these kids. And he told them something in this conversation. He's addressing the whole campers, parents are there. And he says, you will look every coach in the eye when they talk to you. He said, when we coached the Olympic team, and this was obviously before Kobe Bryant passed away. He said, when I'm coaching Kobe Bryant, when I'm coaching LeBron James, I look them in the eye when I talk with them, and the expectation is they'll look me in the eye. So I think the first thing you teach salespeople is, especially if they're customer facing, if they're front facing salespeople, and of course the pandemic has changed that. I get that. But when you're having a conversation with someone, look them in the eye. When you have those interpersonal interactions, the first thing is look them in the eye, because nothing beats eye contact. And that was something that I had to get consistent with in my process that helped me, because I'm very much a person that if something's distracting me, I'll focus that way. And I had to train my brain to look people in the eye. But when I started doing that with my customers, I saw things just start clicking even more and just start getting more powerful. So the first thing I would teach folks in connection is look people in the eye. And you can do that virtually. Like if you notice my eyes have been drifting when Scott's been talking, he's at the bottom of my screen. I pivot my eyes that way because I want to, in a sense, make eye contact with Scott. I want to look and see how his facial reactions are looking, how he's, what's on his face. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, man, use people's names. Use their names often. The sweetest sound to a person is the sound of their own name. And I'm telling you, in my career, in my life, that's been gold for me, is using people's names and building that deeper connection and understanding that you're not just there to sell, you're there to connect. Do you want a one night stand with your customer, or do you want to build a relationship?
Yeah, that's
and
great.
I've never been a guy that I've been married to the same woman for almost 25 years. I'm in it for the long haul. And I think we've got too many salespeople, Richard, that want to hit, the old boxing analogy, stick and move. And so those would be the things that I would teach a young salesperson about connection.
Yeah, we actually just released an episode today with a woman, and she talked about, looking in the camera virtually. And, I even have it set up now where, my screen is literally about 2 inches from my camera. And she talks about, you can actually use your peripheral vision better than you think you can. You can always look at the camera, and I can still see you nodding your head right now, agreeing with me, even though I'm looking at the camera. Right. And she says, you practice it, the better you do it. And I really like that, your point of like, how do I connect? And, when is the right time to look over at you and Scott and, try to do those things. So it's solid advice. I appreciate you bringing that in. It just reconfirms all the other stuff we've been talking about. So what's shifting gears? Pete Rose, does he belong in the Hall of Fame or no? Since you're part of the Cincinnati Reds crew.
100% belongs in the Hall of Fame.
No,
100% belongs in the Hall. No question. Pete Rose was a Hall of Famer before he ever placed his first bet on the Cincinnati Reds. Pete Rose was a Hall of Famer when he played for the Philadelphia Phillies before going to the Montreal Expos. And then here's the funny thing, Richard. The Baseball Hall of Fame has always been able to separate players and managers. Look at Joe Torre. Great player, but not a Hall of Famer. Look at Sparky Anderson. Batted .218 in one major league season. Tony La Russa, Tommy Lasorda. The Hall of Fame has always been able to separate players and managers. Frank Robinson, not a great manager, but hit 586 home runs. So the Hall of Fame has always been able to separate player and manager. Pete Rose bet on the Reds as a manager. And so I think he's got to be in the Hall of Fame. He's the all-time. You'll never be able to take 42-56 out of the record book.
So that's good. Like Scott's over here grinning. He's like, that's the best explanation I've ever heard for this. You're on mute. Scott, there it is. The first time in 2 years. You're on mute.
We got Lisa on mute.
Oh, my God.
Believe it.
Started talking about baseball, and I got all discombobulated. I'm just thinking the same argument holds true with Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and all these
100%.
All these other guys.
But Barry Bonds did it as a player.
Yes, but he was a Hall of Famer, one could argue, already before he ever did anything. He was a Hall of Famer before he ever went to the Giants, which most
I agree with that. I 100%. I mean, back-to-back MVPs in 91 and 92.
Yeah, people forget he was a Pittsburgh Pirate, and he was like amazing as a Pittsburgh Pirate.
And Scott, you make a great point there. Everybody wants to – there are times when people want to group guys into things and say this guy fits in this category or this category. Here's something that people don't understand about Barry Bonds. Guys today owe Barry Bonds a debt of gratitude because when he signed,
they owe him a lot of money too, Brian.
Well, I'm going there. That's where I'm going. When Peter McGowan signed him in in the winter of '92 to that 6 year, he signed him to a 6 year, $42 million contract. Nobody had ever made that kind of money before playing Major League Baseball. And McGowan went out on a limb and said, hey, we're going to go bring Barry Bonds back to the Bay Area where he belongs. And they could have sat on it, man. I mean, they had a great team in '87 with Kevin Mitchell and Will Clark and Matt Williams and those guys. A guy from this area was on that team in '87 and '89. A guy named Don Robinson was from Canova, West Virginia, about 25 minutes west of here. They had a great team in '87. They had a great team in '89 with the Earthquake series that the A's beat them in, I think, 5 or 6 games in the Earthquake series. The Giants had a great team, man. Did they need Barry Bonds? It's arguable. But what Barry Bonds did, man, was he raised the game for everybody else. And he got a lot of guys paid in 93, 95, 96. Of course, the strike was in 94. But, man, Bonds deserves more credit than that because he got guys paid.
So Scott's so excited. He's like, oh my God, I could just sit here and talk to this guy for 2 hours.
Are we going to talk NFL free agency next, Scott? I mean, I saw
maybe Brian and I will start our own podcast. It's all about sports.
I love it, man.
Yes. I can talk about that all day.
I think you guys should just go on Twitch and call baseball games, right?
Actually, that's not a bad idea.
That's actually an excellent Richard, man, you're dropping the good ideas.
I do this for Scott all the time. I give him these great ideas and then he runs with it and makes them.
I'd be down to do that, Brian. Maybe we call the first Reds Giants series, and that'll be our.
I'm down for that, man. I'm totally down.
Right.
I got a question for you guys though. Look at what we're seeing now with the economics of the game, and even owners and things are talking about this with the pandemic affecting revenues and things like that. If you guys had 10 minutes with a professional sports team owner about increasing revenues, what's the first thing you'd ask him? Or what's the first question that would come to mind?
It's interesting. We've had a couple of conversations with the heads of ticket sales of sports teams. But Scott, go ahead and answer. What would be the first thing you'd ask an owner?
I'm going to screw the question up a little bit, but something to the effect of, why are you waiting for somebody else to move first and modernize all of your selling and revenue generation? Because everybody knows that every sports league is a copycat league.
Yep.
About everything from farm systems to player personnel to defensive shifts to whatever. And Richard and I have had many conversations now with professional sports ticket sales orgs, and they all operate like it was 1995. They don't use any modern technology. They don't use modern tactics. They have like 2 or 3 people who've been consulting in that world for the last 40 years. It would be the equivalent of everybody saying, oh yeah, we did Sandler training, or we did Miller Hyman or something like this.
We call out of the yellow pages.
Yeah, there's no innovation. There's no innovation there. There's no use of data. There's no use of technology. So my question to them would be, why are you waiting for somebody else to go first? Because one organization in any sport, one organization could bring in people who have, been very successful at selling technology and bring in those tactics and tools and styles and transform the revenue through ticket sales, through sponsorships, through community building and engagement. And I'm just shocked that nobody does it. And they all sit around still collecting their checks from TV revenue.
They don't care. Yeah. They don't want to spend any extra money. Like they don't see the significance of it.
It's not that hard to tie in the ROI. And if you're a small market team, like a Cincinnati, for example, by comparison to dealing with the New Yorks, the small market teams, and even the smaller, the less high profile sport, like an MLS team or something like that, or a ice hockey team, they rely more on ticket sales than they do on TV revenue. Yeah. So for those type of markets and those type of sports, it seems to me like it's a much larger opportunity and a way to, kind of money ball, if you will, our revenue.
Yeah. Well, Scott, you bring up a great point. These owners feel like, along with the TV revenue and a sweeter stadium deal, or I got to build a new facility that I can't fill anyway, that I'm going to have a hard time filling anyway. Major League Baseball, they aren't selling out every game. Not unless you
got 81 games and you're trying to sell, 20 to 40,000 seat stadiums 81 times. Some of those games are in the middle of the day during the middle of the work week.
Yeah. You know what the most attended game in Cincinnati will be this year? And I live 3 hours east of Cincinnati. Opening day in Cincinnati is a tradition. They close everything down. It's the hardest ticket of the year to get. I've tried. I've gotten on waiting lists, and that was one of the bucket list things I never got to do with my dad before he passed. I wanted to go to an opening day with my dad, but we always got together on every Reds opening day. I'd go to his house, and we'd sit and watch it together. We just never got to do it in person. That's the one game they'll sell out. The second game, they'll have about 75% of that first game, and then it's all downhill from there. And you literally could go to Cincinnati in the middle of June, assuming everything is wide open. You could walk up to the gate, 10 minutes before game time and you could get a really good seat. Or go on StubHub 10 minutes before game time, get a digital ticket and get a great seat. I've never understood why owners have thrown so much into the luxury boxes and to the TV revenue. And to your point, Scott, and it's a great one, instead of connecting with those fans and going, how do we put more butts in the seats? Because the thing about it is, man, when I go to a game, I spend money on concessions.
Yes.
I spend money on and all these other parts that are ancillary revenue that people are just going, take my money, please, take my money. And these owners don't see it.
And they also only think about right now, today, or right now this year. Because the thing is, you got people like us who had kids. You take your kids to a Reds game, or even Marshall, you go to a Thundering Herd football game, whatever. What you're not understanding is, if you get in there early enough, if I started taking my kids when they were 2 and 4 years old to Giants games, right?
Yeah.
You have now got a lifelong.
They don't understand lifetime value.
They don't pay attention to LTV. So the LTV of a young fan is their entire lifespan. It could be 70,
generational, though, Scott.
It could be 70 years, and then to Richard's point, it spreads to the next generation and so forth.
So what's interesting too is that we've had this conversation, Brian, with these folks. They don't even know that they can't even get to the data of that. They really can't.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. To Scott's point, is because they've got a payroll. You know, the front office has set a payroll of X millions of dollars, and you've got an owner that says to them, hey, are we going to be on budget this year? Hey, if we're in contention in June, we may have to bump the budget up a little bit so you guys can go get guys. Or, hey, man, our revenues suck at the gate, and so we're going to have to cut. We're going to have to trade guys that we overpaid in the first place anyway. And Scott, to your point about LTV, I love that point, because how do you think I became a Reds fan? My dad was a Reds fan. Yeah, we grew up listening to it. For us here in this area, it's Reds country. I've gotten the opportunity the last couple of years, I'll share this with you guys, to work the Cincinnati Reds caravan. I've gotten to work with the local radio station. And last year, I got the chance to interview a boyhood hero of mine, Eric Davis, man. Eric the Red. That was my dude growing up in the 80s. And we had probably 2,000 or 3,000 people in the middle of this mall, in our mall, 5 minutes away, that had been there since that morning waiting on the Reds to get there. And we're seeing a sea of people. And it's to your point, Scott, the LTV that the Reds have built up in this area is 2 or 3 times a year, we're going to load up the family. We're going to go to Cincinnati and make a weekend of it. We're going to go see the Reds. We're going to do stuff downtown. We're going to, and we did that when I was a kid, and I write about that in the book. The first Reds game my dad took me to, ironically, was against the Giants in 1977. I still remember it. I was 5 years old. And I don't understand why teams are not trying to build that loyalty. It's a star. If you want a star-driven league like the NBA, great. But wherever that star goes, that fan is going to, wherever LeBron goes, those kids are going to buy those jerseys. Wherever Kyrie Irving goes, or wherever Kevin Durant goes, wherever that's why it was so important for the Bucks to re-sign Giannis Antetokounmpo, is because they knew that those fans in Milwaukee wanted to go see that dude play, and they would follow him. And in Milwaukee, to your point, is a small market team, but there's a lot of things about sales that translate in that sports world, because I think we've got salespeople that are always so fixated on the top line revenue that they're not understanding that if you do the little things right, that ancillary income comes in, and man, that rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah. And I think the tech world and the sales world has done a good job of recognizing that the future of sales lies in customer success. And I don't know that the sports sales world has recognized that at all, right? And at some point, it may come back to bite them in the butt. But I think what really will happen is, I think some org, and it will only take one, some org in some sport is going to flip this thing around and do it the right modern way, and then everybody else will follow suit.
And Scott,
and when that's going to be, I don't know.
And Scott, I'm surprised with Mark Cuban's tech background and you being in Texas. I'm shocked that Cuban hasn't been the guy that's cracked the code on that with his tech background.
Well,
because
the problem there is that Cuban won't return my text. I've been trying.
well, he needs to. Well, and again, man, if you go to Dallas, and I've been to their arena, they've got a beautiful arena, and they put all the stuff around it. And so Cuban is they're about the game day experience. But man, when you've got a guy that's so tech wired that he can't convince the other 29 owners in his league that, to your point, everything is starting to revolve around tech and the fan experience through tech, it amazes me. But to your point, and it was a great point that you or Richard made, one is these owners are still stuck in 1995 saying, well, the cash cow is always going to be there. The cash cow is always going to be there. Why do we have to iterate when the cash cow is always going to be there? And you've got that lone voice in the wilderness going, guys, it ain't always going to be that way. And so that's the one guy that sticks out to me just because of his background is Cuban, how forward thinking he's been on other things.
Yeah, but Cuban's also smart enough to know he's not going to convince a lot of people, right? Like I'm sure he has a couple of owners who get it, right? Like I'm sure, and I don't know, my assumption is, if they're talking about revenue, he could probably talk to the Golden State Warriors more about tech than he could, some of the other team owners, right?
Hey, Richard, I think it's a great, what you just hit on something there. Cuban was going to buy the Chicago Cubs about 10 or 12 years ago. And he was going to pay some kind of astronomical price. It was insane. I forget the number. And baseball owners didn't want Mark Cuban. That's probably the best thing that ever happened to Mark Cuban. Because baseball owners rejecting him is again why their sport is not growing exponentially like the NFL and the NBA. I mean, I'm a Bengals fan. Make the jokes that you want to make, but man, that franchise is now valued at over $1 billion.
I think they all are, right?
Yeah,
like,
and so
everybody,
even
right?
Even the bottom rung teams of the NFL know how to make money, and that's why the NFL is absolutely the greatest league on the planet.
Yeah, but the NFL gets all their money from TV rights.
Well, and right. And Richard, to your point, they figured out how to play this year as simply a made for TV product, because how many stadiums were empty this year?
Yeah, it's been interesting. We gotta wrap this up. Unfortunately, it's been a great episode about some level of sales, but a whole lot of fun about sports. So we appreciate it.
I'm down for that, man. I'm down for that.
I look forward to listening to the two of you on Twitch live for the Giants Reds game.
We're gonna make that happen.
I'm absolutely down for that.
This will be the first time Scott actually tries to learn a technology. He'll actually put the effort in. So
that part just gave me a little shiver of fear. But the actual calling of the game, I got no fear about that. I'm ready.
So
Twitch to a West Virginian is probably a neurological disease. So I'm gonna have to figure out Twitch myself.
So anyway, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Salesforce Revenue Cloud, Lead 411, and Gong.io. And please, give Brian Sexton and the Intentional Encourager podcast a listen. Lots of fun and interesting stories, lots of inspirational things. Definitely talks about business, but talks about life. So I had a good time being on it. And, I think he's really putting good karma in the world, which is one of the things I love about Brian. So Brian, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Guys, I appreciate it. Don't forget my book, People Buy From People's out there.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, they can go get People Buy From People. And I'm working on the second book, which is going to be called The Intentional Encourager. Hope to have that out early to mid July is the preliminary release date on that. But guys, what a blast it's been. Connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with me on Twitter. And man, Richard, Scott, this has been great. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, actually, we forgot to ask the last question. So the last question is, for those who stick around this long, what advice can we give you? What did you like to ask us?
I want to know from you guys how you went about building a successful network and how you incorporated your podcast into the midst of your network, because that's something that I'm kind of struggling with is really taking this thing to the next level. So I want to know from two guys that are doing it, how did you grow your network and incorporate your podcast into that offering around content?
Well, I'll start with this one because it was all my idea, which Scott likes. About 4 years ago, we figured out how to start growing our network on LinkedIn in general terms, right? How to scale it. and what the value of connections were. I had always been commenting and writing on stuff on LinkedIn and, you know, getting decent response. And I discovered a tool that let me do this at scale, little black hat, but I don't care. And I was able to connect with more people. And then I shared the idea with Scott because he was starting to share stuff and starting to think about his side hustle. So of course, Scott immediately takes what I teach him and explodes it like beyond belief, right? Because Scott's more strategic around it. So that's where that piece. So we consciously built the network first. The podcast, I don't even think was an idea, like for 4 years. And then I guess a year and a half ago, I decided, I was talking to our good friend, John Barrows, and I'm like, you know, because he has a podcast. I'm like, why, you know, do I need to do a podcast? Like, I don't know if anybody's going to listen. He's like, dude, people want to hear what we have to say. Like, you know, don't worry about it. Just put it out there and see what happens. And I'm in my standard response of imposter syndrome. I'm like, oh, I'm too scared to do this by myself. So I was down doing something with Scott. I said, dude, I'm thinking of doing this. And I think we're better together than we are apart. And he immediately got it. The idea was, let's go Netflix style where we drop a bunch of episodes all at once, try and be different. And that's where it started. Right. And then since then, Scott's taken this stuff to a whole other level around community and network and building and posting well beyond what I ever did. So that's my version of the story in terms of things.
I would say there's a few different things. Number one, to Richard's point, we built the network first. So I can imagine a whole other struggle, you know, trying to grow a podcast while also trying to grow a network. That wasn't our struggle. We already had the network. Then, you know, and Richard mentioned this, we're better together. Like, you combine two people's networks instead of just one. You split the work rather than do it all yourself, whether it's, you know, uploading stuff or finding guests and scheduling them, or even just thinking of questions to ask people. Right? There's plenty of times on the show where Richard and I will, you know, chat each other on the side, be like, hey, you go next. Hey, your turn. Ask about this. Like, it just makes it easier, you know? And then it increases the guest list, who you can pull from, because Richard knows people and pull some people. I know people and pull some people. It was definitely Richard's idea to do the podcast. And although I think it was my idea to brand it the same name as Surf and Sales.
Yes, 100%.
Because I was like, we already have this event and this business. Why don't we just make, you know, that the name of the podcast, so it's less things for people to remember, right? Like, if we called the show, I don't know, The Excuse Factory, right? People would be like, well, who does that? Well, there was already name association with Surf and Sales. So I think that you know, that helped. So there's a couple little cheat codes there, if you will, Brian, that we, you know, sort of strategically cobbled together and also just kind of got lucky. You know, it's not like we said 10 years ago, 5 years ago, hey, let's build a huge network and then build a podcast. No, we just never even thought about podcasts.
The other thing I would say, and I've been talking and preaching this for a while, and you know, we've been giving people advice of like, you know, you're officially Brian Sexton LLC. Like, we told our good friend Colin Cadness, you know, because he was thinking about going out. I'm like, everything Colin does, everything you do is an asset. Your LinkedIn post is an asset that could also run on your blog, that could go out in your newsletter, right? Your book and your podcast, The Intentional Encourager, those are now they're an asset. So think about things at an asset level. And yes, you still have to keep focusing on the network side, but now now I think you get more vision, right? And to a certain extent, you get to use the content in more than one place, right? So that's
great advice. It's great. The only other question I would have for you, Scott, is how do you teach a 6'3", 270-pound guy that's unathletic and two bad knees how to surf?
Dude, I'm 5'11" and way overweight, so I'm right there with you.
It can be done. I'll just say that it can be done. Plus, if nothing else, you get some sunshine on the beach in Costa Rica with a little fruity cocktail in your
there's
hand,
about
cocktail.
If we take 15 people, there's at least 5 or 6 who after the first day of surf lessons don't even try to surf anymore. They just want to come out, they want to do it, but then they kind of realize, wait a minute, there's these great hammocks right by the beach, or I can just chill. And right. So it's
Hey, Richard, my problem would be that someone would see me and as white as I am and try to harpoon me. They're like, check out that whale out there that's on a surfboard.
Trust me,
and they would be shooting flares out there and trying to reel in the big one.
It's all good. It's all good. Hey, man, Brian, thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
Boys, it's been a blast. I appreciate you, Richard. Thanks, Scott. Been a fun time, man.